Paul always suspected King Crab was more of a title than a name. And he wants to be the first human to bend the claw. Because one day, the crustaceans will rise, and only Paul will be spared. Foresight's a wonderful thing. Invest in innovation, including 3D printing, with Opto.
Welcome, Doomberg. It's great to have you back on the show. How are things?
Things are great. Great to be back. Looking forward to another fantastic discussion.
Yeah, fantastic. As we were discussing off the call, I'm interested to essentially dive into 3 of the articles you've recently written and published on your Substack. We'll include the links to each of those in the episode description as well. Each of them, I guess, tackles a renewable energy source. The first we'll tackle is solar, followed by hydrogen, natural hydrogen in particular, and then we'll look at nuclear energy to finish. But if we start with solar, that article that I referenced at the start of the call, it argues that solar energy isn't as cheap as commonly believed, and there's a few sort of myths to bust in that respect. So perhaps you can elaborate on the hidden costs associated with solar power that often go unmentioned.
Yeah, it's a great question. And as you said, it was the subject of a piece rather directly titled, "No, Solar Isn't Cheap." And so we kind of gave away the secret in the title. So when proponents of solar and wind talk about the relative cheapness of those technologies, they're almost always conflating short-term spot market prices for electricity and the long-term average delivered cost of electricity to consumers. And inevitably, whenever you introduce intermittent sources of energy like wind and solar, they are not just introduced in a vacuum, they are actually added to a pre-existing grid. And because of that intermittency, the operators of those grids have to jump through, Herculean circles to adapt to the ever-changing nature of the supply. And a grid has to be perfectly balanced between supply and demand, which is actually quite challenging to do. And it's a wonder of modern engineering that we in the Western world take an always-on grid for granted. It really is one of the core public goods at the heart, the beating heart, really, of the Western and global economies. We take it for granted. We just assume that energy comes from a light switch and it always works. So when solar is introduced into a grid, in order to make room for it, it necessitates that some other baseload power, i.e. natural gas-driven turbines or nuclear energy plants or coal-fired plants, have to turn down in response to very sunny days or very windy days. And the costs associated with doing that are real. They get passed on to consumers, but they don't get counted against solar, because if a natural gas peaker plant is expensive to run because all those fixed costs are still there, that's assigned to the natural gas peaker plant. And so in aggregate, generally speaking, the more solar you introduce into a grid, the more expensive the electricity becomes. And this is especially true in sort of less sunny northern climates because of the idiosyncrasies of when electricity is actually in the highest demand. Now, as we mentioned in the article, one of the best places in the US to introduce solar, theoretically, is California. It's sunny. It's called the sun, it's a very sunny state. And also because of its geography, its relative proximity to the equator, its electricity demand peaks out during the day when there's copious amounts of sunshine because of the need for air conditioning. Thermal comfort needs involve cooling, and cooling is an electricity hog. And in California, no other state in the US has introduced more solar than California. And they have the highest, most expensive energy bills in the lower 48. And so if they're getting 38% of their energy, and this is the cheapest source around, you would think that their electricity bills would be the cheapest in the country, and instead they're the most expensive. And this is no surprise to people who are familiar with how a grid actually operates.
Yeah, really interesting. And that practical example of California helps to make it a little less abstract. I'm sure that will resonate with a few listeners in California as well. On that point of intermittency, then, if we assume then as the article states, solar is actually more expensive than most realize, apart from those kind of intimately aware of the grid. What are the main kind of technical and economic hurdles that we need to overcome to effectively store and dispatch solar power to ensure both a stable energy supply, but perhaps a less or a more cost-efficient one as well?
Yeah, before I answer that, I should say things get worse the more you add solar to a grid because they are all producing at the same time. And so you see this massive swings, even negative electricity prices, which are actually just signs of market failure, I should say. You could put a bit of solar in and be able to manage it around the edges, especially if you have some hydroelectricity, water stored behind dams to act as a giant battery. Which brings me to the answer to this question, which is the things that would be necessary in order to accommodate a significant amount of solar into a pre-existing grid. The most common answer is battery storage. But once you include the amount of batteries you would actually need to properly back up a grid, if you allocate that to the cost of solar, quote unquote, it becomes prohibitively expensive. Now, there are some exceptions, and I referenced one. So take the country of Norway. Norway has a huge amount of hydroelectricity, and the water stored behind its dams acts as a giant battery for Europe, and Europe is becoming ever more interconnected. And so to some extent, if hydroelectricity is going to be your swing producer, your sort of the facility that smooths out the edges of the extremes, then that can work. And in Quebec as well, obviously Hydro-Quebec is one of the biggest producers of hydroelectricity, and they are shopping themselves as the northeastern battery to the northeastern states in the U.S. There are limits to those things, and of course hydroelectricity is not without its own negative environmental externalities. Just ask the caribou of northern Quebec if you have any doubt about that. But by and large, the technological limitations for storage are you might need it for a long time. Like the totality of all of the grid batteries installed in the USA today, I believe, could back up the grid for 8 minutes. And in theory, you would need days and days of backup for cloudy periods and winter doldrums and so on. But then even that doesn't really work, because what's the return on investment for the battery owners? Like, you put all this capital to work and it just sits there and only comes in when it's needed. It's really the equivalent of a natural gas peaker plant. If you have an entire natural gas plant that has an employee and fixed cost base and needs to be ready to come on a moment's notice, that's no way to run a grid. And so this is the fundamental challenge of solar. One interesting technology that we wrote relatively favorably about is the prospect of thermal batteries, which is about the only plausible way that we see where we could potentially decarbonize industrial grade steam. That's in its early stages. It's a long way out, but it's an interesting technology, but that's not going to solve the grid issues anytime soon.
Yeah, no, I completely take your point. Well, I guess one thing that we haven't really touched on too much then is how subsidies for solar power distort the energy market. You talked about how it might be more costly than people first realize, and obviously subsidies, I suppose, exacerbate that same issue. So what would a more kind of balanced approach to incentivizing clean energy, and particularly solar, look like in your opinion?
So I'm not sure that there's a proper way to subsidize solar, because our general view is it's not really needed if your sincere intent is to decarbonize the electricity grid, because there's an obvious way to do that, and that's through nuclear power, which I know we're going to talk about a little later. So in almost every instance, solar is sort of a low entropy parasite onto a grid. And the grid has to sort of rearrange itself to accommodate this political intervention. Left to its own devices, the engineers who operate our grid would not be bringing on solar as a solution to decarbonization. Now, we can agree or not on whether decarbonization is in itself an objective worth chasing, but in a world where that is an axiom, i.e. our objective is to create abundant supplies of electricity as cheaply as possible with as low a carbon footprint as possible, then you start with the highest energy dense carbon-free source of power there is, and that's nuclear energy. It's been around for decades. It's safe. France and Ontario have proven that you can have extremely green grids by going all nuclear, basically. There's a bit of fudge factor in there, but 70% plus nuclear. The province of Ontario has one of the cleanest grids in the world, and nuclear is at the beating heart of that. And so the answer exists. For political reasons, environmentalists have chosen to oppose it and have done their best to make it expensive. But so I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about what's the best way to fix our subsidy regime to make solar more practical, because the assumption embedded in that question is just not one we believe.
Yeah, got it. And you rightly point out, we'll get to nuclear. I'm keen to finish on that for obvious reasons. But before we move on from solar, just one more question then. You mentioned environmental kind of concerns that exist around uranium. Obviously, there's some maybe less publicized around solar energy and technology as well. How do the life cycle environmental impacts of solar panels, for example, compare to those of other energy sources?
Well, just like the question of relative cheapness, the answer to such questions involves highly political assumptions. And depending on who you ask and what their biases are, you'll get wildly different answers. We tried to address this in a piece called Solar Calculator, where we did our best to estimate, for example, the energy payback period of solar. And we settled on a range between 2 and 5 years in sunny locations, which is pretty reasonable. It's the issue with these types of life cycle analyses is it really is all about the assumptions. Now, there are reasonably good technologies to recycle solar panels, and the materials inside of solar make it worth doing. And so this is not really a huge technical problem. There are some well-known startup companies in this space who are developing and bringing to market technology to enable sufficient recycling. In the right location with proper maintenance, a good solar installation could last you 20, 25 years. Now, if it gets hit by a hailstorm or, as we've seen in the news, quite high profile incidents where thousands of panels get destroyed in a freak of nature storm. But overall, I think the life cycle analyses of solar are relatively reasonable, not totally objectionable, and I don't view the need to recycle these panels as a showstopper. Whereas with wind energy, for example, that's a real challenge because there's really nothing of value to fish out of these turbines. And so there's no economic driver to recycle them, and they're very difficult and expensive to grind up and to do anything with. And so that's why we see these graveyards of giant wind turbines in the US, and I assume they must exist in Europe as well. And that's a much bigger challenge than for solar.
Yeah, got it. And not discussing wind might have seemed a kind of glaring omission, within today's agenda. I mean, it's simply due to the fact that we don't have inordinate amount of times to spend on this, but we will include your latest article on wind, both in the episode description, just for balance. But I do want to move on to hydrogen, natural hydrogen in particular. The article discussed, I think, in one paragraph, the extent to which natural hydrogen is, to use a quote from your piece, whether it's a game changer. I don't think a lot of people will be familiar with natural hydrogen in particular in terms of the listenership of this podcast. So perhaps you can just explain what this energy source is and why it is or isn't a game changer.
So it's an interesting technology, and the point of our article was to debate with ourselves and with our subscribers as to whether it was something or nothing. Before I dive into what natural hydrogen is, it's sort of the analogy of horizontal drilling before the shale revolution. Like, is this really something? It's the type of breakthrough that if it were real, it would be so consequential that it would be kind of difficult to model, and people would be slow to internalize the consequences of it. I'm not saying it's that, but if it is that, then it could be a real breakthrough. So hydrogen as a molecule is a gas, a flammable gas, and it combusts with oxygen to make water and releases a lot of energy in the process. And what it does not release, of course, is carbon dioxide, because there's no carbon in hydrogen. It's just, it's just a simple molecule that burns. The thing about hydrogen is it is produced today at massive scale in the petrochemical industry. It's a very useful molecule. It can be used for burning and also in chemical reactions and refining oil and gas. And so hydrogen as a standalone molecule is well understood. Relatively easy to handle. It's a gas and you got to put it through pipelines, but these are solved problems that industry does every day. And in the renewable world, One of the things it is envisioned that might and could be done with excess solar energy, for example, is that you would run an electrolyzer and split water back into hydrogen and oxygen, and then you would have that as a fuel source for use later on, perhaps when the sun isn't shining. Now, the problem with that embodiment of the hydrogen story is that it's a pretty inefficient round trip. You lose about half of the energy. You have to put in twice as much energy as you can get out of it in order to split the water in the first place. Round numbers, I'm sure somebody will argue on the decimal points. But now natural hydrogen is a whole different thing, which is as a result of geological activities deep underground. There are vast amounts of naturally occurring hydrogen that can, in theory, be drilled for. It's early days. If that actually sort of runs the technological learning curve, the same one that horizontal drilling did, it could be that we could have an abundant supply of carbon-free energy that is largely a drop-in to a lot of the things we do to power our lives, and that would be great, and we should all cheer that. And so we're certainly open-minded. We're hopeful. More energy is better. Energy is life. And if you could drill for hydrogen, for example, a hydrogen-powered internal combustion engine is a very solved problem effectively today. There's some worries about safety and some worries about range, but we drive around cars with flammable gasoline in them, and we drive around long-haul trucks with compressed natural gas in them. These aren't unsolved problems, and Toyota has a very nice, regular-looking hydrogen-powered internal combustion engine. The fancy technology folks want to put it through, at the past hydrogen over. The name escapes me now, but to make electricity out of it and to propel the cars with electric motors, fuel cells. Sorry. And so there's various ways we could use it. I think the easiest way would just be internal combustion engines. That technology exists, and I think it'd be great. It also could be useful for long haul trucking as well. You would have to have a new development of hydrogen stations sort of strategically positioned along the highway, but natural hydrogen would be a game changer. The odds of it happening in the next year, 2 years in any meaningful way, pretty low, but I wouldn't rule out 10 years from now. When we look across the potential for game-changing energy revolutions, natural hydrogen, for example, is much more realistic and much more exciting to us than fusion, for example.
Yeah, interesting. What then are the main challenges, I suppose, associated with extracting and utilizing natural hydrogen on a commercial scale? Just to kind of actually turn this into a practical consideration, it almost sounds too good to be true, these kind of unrealized, huge deposits of this energy resource that doesn't include carbon. But are there any significant hurdles to extracting and utilizing that energy?
I think the biggest hurdle is it hasn't been done before. And so unless and until it has been, piloted at proper scale, and then a market development plant is built, and then a commercial development is done, it's not proven, and unproven technologies are justifiably assumed to be expensive until definitively shown otherwise. And but we are watching it carefully, and I think there's a number of dozens of companies that are actively exploring this. And the thing about natural hydrogen, if it were real, is that the industry knows how to handle it. Like the industry, we already have miles and miles and miles of hydrogen pipeline, mostly on the Gulf Coast for refinery needs. We know what to do with it. There's all manner of useful things society could do. It would be the ultimate compromise. We would still need the fossil fuel companies basically to drill and handle and move these molecules around, but we would have an ample amount of energy with no carbon emissions, which you would think that environmentalists would be for that. Although, as we said in the piece, a sure sign that this might be interesting is the fact that they're already coming out to oppose it. My favorite counter argument against it was we might accidentally find oil and gas while looking for hydrogen, which seemed like a funny thing to say. But alas, no matter what the technology is, there's somebody somewhere opposed to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to continue on that kind of comparison with other available energy sources and fuels, then how does the energy density of hydrogen compare to other fuels, and are there any implications of that in that respect to storage and transportation?
Yeah, so energy density is actually it depends if you're measuring gravimetric density or volumetric density.
Right.
And since hydrogen is a very light gas, you kind of have to have a hybrid of both. It's very energy dense. If you ever like lit, well, hydrogen explodes violently. Like there's a lot of energy. That the reaction of hydrogen plus oxygen to yield water releases an enormous amount of energy. And harnessing that energy is relatively solved. Storing it on a car, for example, developments in high pressure containers that can safely handle enough hydrogen to get you 300 or 350 miles of range is well developed. And if it were to be implemented at scale, we would climb down the cost curve rather quickly for such materials, and sub-industries would arise to feed them. And the nice thing about hydrogen, unlike, say, battery-powered electric vehicles, is that the filling time would be equivalent to, putting gasoline or petrol in your car today. It'd be rather quick to refuel, and so you could get 300 miles of range in a matter of minutes, just like we do with gasoline today. And so, other than the public's perception of safety issues, and look, if your hydrogen tank explodes, it's not going to be pretty. But I was just driving on a highway over the weekend, and somebody's car was engulfed in flames because it overheated. Nothing in life is without trade-off, but even for industry, natural hydrogen that is economic would be a game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple more questions then before we move on to nuclear. The penultimate one for this section, again, just want to speak to the environmental impact this energy source could engender, I suppose, if it were to be pursued at scale. How does the extraction and the use of natural hydrogen compare to other energy sources that's related to solar and nuclear from an environmental perspective, but then also compared to other hydrogen production methods that are more widely used at the moment?
Yeah, so that the predominant way in which hydrogen is synthesized in industry is through reforming of natural gas, and to a lesser extent using coal. One of the huge environmental benefits of natural hydrogen, for example, is that we could make fertilizer carbon-free. Right now, most fertilizer in the world is, well, ammonia. I'm speaking broadly. There's obviously different kinds of fertilizer, but ammonia is synthesized through the Haber process, which requires pure hydrogen, and that hydrogen is today synthesized by reforming natural gas. You could do away with the carbon inputs into a major chunk of the world's fertilizer needs. That would be consequential. And that's just beyond just sort of the passenger car stuff. Now, the carbon dioxide ultimately that is produced on the back end of a fertilizer plant can be captured today and used for enhanced oil recovery and various other uses. And some of it is used for the cold chain and for carbonating beverages and so on, but those are relatively modest demands that are well satisfied today from existing facilities. If you were to produce hydrogen from solar and nuclear, the challenge there is the efficiency losses that we talked about. Powering an electrolyzer and collecting the hydrogen causes a severe degradation in the usable energy. Now, if you've got way more solar than you need, maybe you're not, and it's like negatively priced in the market because there's too much of it, you could make a case for losing half of that energy on the round trip. Same with nuclear, of course. But natural hydrogen would be preferred because it's just right like anything else. You can make natural gas from CO2. It's just going to be expensive and very energy intense. You can make hydrogen from water. You can make hydrogen from natural gas. But why go through those steps if you could just drill for it and it's there?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, just to finish on this section then, and you alluded to it earlier, but given the kind of nascency of this space overall, what do you believe the really realistic timeline for natural hydrogen to become a more significant player in the energy sector to be? I think you mentioned, rather than a year, we're talking multiple years, but is that it, or are we actually talking decades?
If it's real, I will know well within a decade if it's real. There's a big report from the USGS coming. It may have already published. I'll have to go look after this podcast to see there are serious people looking at this. There's serious money being invested in it, and if it works, there'd be no reason to oppose it, really. Although, again, people invent reasons to oppose nuclear, which we'll talk about next. But So I would say we'll know more in the next 18 months. And if it is real, it could go as fast as shale did in the U.S. The rate of technological innovation in the U.S. shale patch has shocked people. Some of the early players in shale are now taking a look at natural hydrogen. And so if there's some there, we'll know. We're not big believers in sort of conspiracy of cover up of energy sources or energy breakthroughs like this. So
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, no, that helps to kind of put a kind of I guess bookend this kind of concept. And I think leads us nicely on to talking about nuclear. We've referenced it a couple of times. I'm glad I left it to the end. It might make the rest of this discussion relatively redundant, given how bullish you are on nuclear, for reasons that we'll get into in a second. In the article, Be Like Ike is the particular article I'm referencing. Again, we'll link that in the episode description. You reference President Eisenhower's support for nuclear energy. If we use that as a timestamp, how has the perception and role of nuclear power evolved since that time?
So Eisenhower was really a transformative president. Not only did he, lay out the U.S. national highway system, which is called the Dwight Eisenhower National Highway System, he also championed atoms for peace and really gave birth to the civil use of nuclear energy that we enjoy today. And we would not have 90 plus operating reactors in the US churning out baseload power with 92, 93% capacity factors were it not for his efforts. And back in the day, the wonders of nuclear energy were, even though we had just dropped 2 bombs on Japan, the wonders of nuclear energy for civilian use were being celebrated, as they should have been. Now, in the intervening time, unfortunately, some rather Malthusian environmentalists who are opposed to primary energy development because they believe that it puts too big a burden on the rest of the planet's resources. They invented reasons to be opposed to nuclear energy. Most effectively, they've scared people around the subject of nuclear meltdown and or the toxicity, quote unquote, of nuclear waste. And even the word waste needs to be put in quotations as well. They have been very successful in that regard. It started in the 60s and continues through till today. They're beginning to lose that argument, I think, but it has been extremely successful in both stunting the growth of nuclear energy and making it more expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get into the kind of political conversation or discourse around this energy source then. Despite significant advancements, public kind of fear, I suppose, around nuclear safety remains. What do you see as the biggest misconceptions about nuclear energy safety? Perhaps you can point to a few myths and we can look to bust those.
Sure. So here's one. We have looked and others have looked. We cannot identify a single person who's ever been injured from nuclear waste on the planet. And compare that with collapsing hydroelectric dams. So we wrote a piece long ago about a major collapse of a dam in China in the 1970s because of a freak storm. And they can't even count the number of people who were killed. The estimates range from, I think, 50 to 200,000 and change. Imagine if a nuclear reactor had melted down and killed 50,000 people. Do you think we would still have nuclear reactors today? Of course not. But we still live under the threat of dam collapse. There's all manner of aging dams in the United States. We just saw one collapse in Minnesota. It was a hydroelectric dam. It was producing electricity. The word missing from the debate is trade-offs. And if we have a reasonable discussion of the trade-offs between the safe handling of the minuscule amount of nuclear waste, which we know how to do, versus blighting the landscape with solar panels or, killing people with hydroelectric dam collapses or completely redirecting entire watersheds in the name of creating hydroelectricity, like that's been done in Quebec very famously with the James Bay project. These are all trade-offs, and we can have intelligent discussions about those trade-offs and then collectively, with a scientific basis, decide which of those risks, quote unquote, do we wish to take. So let's just take nuclear waste, for example, another myth. Nuclear waste isn't actually waste. We only typically use about 5% of the embodied potential energy in uranium first pass through the nuclear reactors. And in fact, what we call waste today is really just a future generation's fuel source because you could run them through fast breeder reactors and reconstitute them and get more of the energy back out a second and third, fourth time. And so we barely, there's so much energy in uranium that we barely scratched the surface on the stuff we've exploited. We'll never run out of it. We could literally power virtually anything we want with nuclear. And if we did so at scale, it would become less expensive, not more. If we standardize things, put it this way, if France could build out 60 gigawatts of nuclear in the 70s, surely the US could do it today.
Yeah.
And the hurdles to it are artificial and political, not scientific.
Yeah. Okay, well then, to play devil's advocate then, what if you were challenging kind of the scaling of nuclear energy production and use worldwide or just in the US, what challenges would you be using to prevent the scaling of that energy source? Like, think of it from your kind of counterpart's perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, how would I stop it if I wanted to be cynical and manipulative? Yeah, I would hype up the fear angle. I would infiltrate the NRC with allies who are in there to throw sand in the gears, and they do exist. That's a reality of the U.S. regulatory framework. And I would conflate civilian nuclear energy with nuclear bombs. These are all things I would vastly exaggerate proliferation risk, et cetera. Look, there are no trade-off-free energy sources, but nuclear is, for example, just take shipping, right? With a small nuclear reactor, we could wipe out carbon emissions from global shipping. Like, again, there's very little that nuclear couldn't do with the right political will. But they have, like, hats off to the environmentalists. They have succeeded in freaking people out about nuclear energy. Again, if a dam collapse can kill 10,000 people or flood a city, and we still use hydroelectricity, and in fact, we call it green. I mean, it's renewable, it's green, it's great. All green is good, even the green chicken. Surely the fact that a hailstorm is not going to hurt a nuclear power plant, but it wiped out 1,000, 2,000 solar panels. There are trade-offs to all of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we look at the economic argument, we've addressed the scientific and the political. What kind of arguments, what are the key cases for nuclear energy being a big part of the future energy mix around the world, especially in comparison to the other renewable energy sources we've already discussed?
So nuclear is expensive today for a variety of reasons, most of which political, as we said, but also the industry has done itself no favors. A standardized design, much like Canada has done with the CANDU reactor system. I think it really doesn't matter which design you pick, as long as you pick the same one and build it over and over and over again with very little variance, you should be fine. The thing about nuclear, though, is once it's built, I mean, it's good for 80 years. You're getting carbon-free, relatively cheap, reliable baseload power. Again, all the things that make solar expensive make nuclear cheap, because it's very easy and predictable to incorporate a nuclear power plant into the grid as long as it's not being disrupted by intermittent sources like solar.
Yeah, got it. And how pivotal could the small modular reactors prove in combating some of the challenges we've already been mentioned and discussed, and ultimately positioning nuclear as a critical element of that future energy mix that we just discussed?
So small modular reactors are interesting because many feel they're not needed. Large modular reactors work just fine. And in fact, I have sort of a counter argument to that, which refers back to the industrial steam case we talked about earlier. I do think small modular reactors of the latest design types are capable of producing industrially significant temperature grades of steam, and that there are many cogeneration facilities around the world which burn natural gas to produce both heat and electricity, and nuclear could take some of that market share, not all of it, but could take a good fair bit of it. And the thing about these types of facilities is they're already sort of on brownfield sites, and small modular reactors have a much smaller radius of concern. And so you can imagine embedding them in these already secured industrial sites with relatively low risk. But again, there's lots we could do with the technology we have today. And so in many ways, these types of moonshot R&D type projects for nuclear are a distraction from the fact that the answer is already there, and we just should take the old technology that we know works and deploy it. That's our main critique of fusion, by the way. Fusion it solves fake problems. It solves fake problems, and it's not going to be more economical than fission, and so we viewed it just as a distraction from fission. And by the time fusion became economically viable, the same environmentalists would invent reasons to oppose it then. So there are no trade-off-free energy sources. Nuclear's trade-offs are comparatively tiny relative to the abundance of carbon-free power it produces. And so, no matter, all roads lead to Rome, in our view. And so if we truly care about carbon emissions, then you can't be opposed to nuclear energy. And if you're opposed to nuclear energy, you can't truly care about carbon emissions. That's sort of the logical view from our end.
Yeah, got it. Well, I think that's a perfect segue then into my final question, which is how crucial, in your opinion, is nuclear energy in achieving global decarbonisation? Can we realistically achieve it without nuclear energy is maybe more the pertinent question.
Yeah, we certainly can't achieve it without nuclear energy, but I don't know that we can achieve it even with nuclear energy. Our view is that all primary energy sources are additive, and the gating function of fossil fuels is production. And every molecule of fossil fuels produced will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions against that merely shift who has the privilege of doing it. And we see that with the latest data out of the Statistical Review of World Energy. The emerging world is burning as much fossil fuels as they can get their hands on, and who could blame them, because this is the path out of energy poverty for them. Emissions in the developed world are actually flat to declining, and yet global emissions are still rising because the offset is being soaked up over there. And so if we produce a bunch of nuclear here and stop burning natural gas to produce electricity, for example, unless we stop producing natural gas, somebody else will buy it and burn it. And so the gating function of consumption is production. And much of the world's fossil fuels aren't produced in Europe, for example. Europe produces almost none. And so what Europe does for its grid is basically irrelevant to the rest of the world. So that's our view. But for sure, there's no theoretical way, even we think, to do it without nuclear. And even if you have nuclear, it's not clear to us that it would work.
Yeah, I mean, makes complete sense. A bleak kind of view, if not a completely realistic one. And I think that's all we've got time for. I think that's been incredibly insightful. And I hope it gives listeners a good overview of some of the kind of most talked about renewable energy sources, and obviously from your perspective, why nuclear is so important to that future energy mix. That just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining us on the podcast again, Doomberg. It's been a real pleasure.
Anytime, my good friend, and talk soon.